Time it is. It is time to travel through the Word with me this week. Let's see where we have traveled. In the Old Testament, we had Isaiah 7 through 22. We also had Psalms. Well, that's interesting that my paper says 9:22, but it should say Psalms 22, 118 and 62. And then with the New Testament, we had Matthew 26 through 28. So we finished up that book and we started on Corinthians and we had 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. So let's get into it. We'll start with Isaiah. Chapter 7 of Isaiah. This was a message to Ahaz, basically, to tell him, listen, calm down. God had not forgotten his promise. He wouldn't allow Israel and Aram to destroy them. Now, mind you, Ahaz had his own problems, okay? Because remember, Ahaz was the one that, didn't do all the stuff he was supposed to be doing. He didn't trust God. And he got in a bit of trouble because he tried to be allied with somebody else and took money from the temple and tried to use that to bribe somebody. But God did say, listen, I remember my promise, and he wasn't going to allow Judah to go down that way. And so we get the Emmanuel prophecy. Emmanuel means God with us. And they say you could look at this two ways. If you want an immediate context, it would be like Isaiah and his wife who would have a son, okay? And what would happen before that son died. And then you can look at it in the future, speaking of the Messiah, Christ, okay, being born to a virgin. So God would use the Assyrians to save Israel to save Judah from Israel, and the kings of Israel and Aram got together and they were going to destroy Judah. But God wasn't having it. So he would use the Assyrians to keep that from happening. But then he would turn around and also use the Assyrians to discipline Judah for their idolatry. And then chapter 8, we get the coming Assyrian invasion. All right. And so although God had used the Assyrians to save Judah, then you would think Judah would have repented, right? Nope, they didn't. So now they're about to be disciplined heavily. So chapter 9, we talk about the birth of the Prince of Peace. Okay, God would bring honor to his people. And guess what? It talks about this hand raised against Israel. Okay, so Isaiah had to prophesy to not only Judah, but he also had to prophesy to Israel. And he was letting them know they, which included the leaders, the prophets, and the elders, would be punished for their behavior and how they had handled things. And you get to chapter 10, and it starts with a woe. We've talked about what a woe means, okay? God expects his people to take care of the poor and the oppressed, and they were not doing that. And so what you end up with is you got the Assyrians who are going to be used as an instrument of God for his wrath. Then you're going to have a judgment on the Assyrians because they were doing more than what God wanted them to do. And they thought that their strength was in them, not God. But then God says, after that, I would have a remnant return. Okay? Because God would eventually judge Assyria. And then chapter 11, we talk about the reign of the Davidic king, and that would be Jesus, okay? Because God had not forgotten his covenant. All right? Israel would be regathered. Okay? God would initiate a second Exodus. All right? He would again divide the waters for them to cross over for their rescue. And so I said for this section, I said, Lord, remind me that regardless of what wickedness humans have planned, you are always working in the background scenes to accomplish your purpose. So it doesn't matter what people plan against you. Okay? I'm not going to interfere with your purpose. And so my question for you is, you do know that you have a responsibility to care for the poor and advocate for the oppressed, right? I hope so. Now, for Isaiah chapters 12 through 16. Chapter 12 was a song of praise, all right? Talks about when Israel would meet her king and acknowledge Christ at the second coming. Chapter 13 was a pronouncement against Babylon, all right? They would be destroyed for their pride. And when you see the word Babylon in the Bible, know it signifies arrogance, evil, and opposition to God. And then you get chapter 14, it will talk about Israel's return and the downfall of the king of Babylon. All right. And they compare it to the downfall of Satan. Assyria would be destroyed. All right. And there was a pronouncement against Philistine. Now remember, Philistines was Israel's stark enemy. They were like just enemies on opposite sides. But Assyrians would end up slaughtering them. And then we get to chapter 15. There's a pronouncement against Moab. Now, Moab was a descendant of the son of Lot. Remember Lot, Abraham's nephew? He was a descendant. So you would think he would be okay with all this, but he wasn't. They were also one of Israel's cruelest enemies. They also were destroyed by the Assyrians. Then you get to chapter 16, and you have Moab's pronouncement is continued, okay? They would send like lambs. This was like figurative. They would send lambs to the mountains of the daughter of Zion, hoping to find asylum. All right. And although Assyria would get destroyed, Moab would be swept into the dustpan of history for its long arrogance of rejecting God. And so for me, I said, Lord, remind me that you will use whatever means necessary to get my attention. And then for you, I said, you do realize that any plans that you have that go against the plans of God, they will utterly fail. I promise you. And then we get to chapter 17. There's a pronouncement against Damascus. See how we're doing all these pronouncements here? There's one against Damascus, okay? There was judgment against Israel, all right? Now, Damascus is the place where the king of Aram and Israel made a bad alliance because they were going to ward off the Assyrians. But then what happened was it failed, all right? And then here they are, they're crying out to God because their plan didn't work. They were going to go against Judah also. And then chapter 18, you have the Lord's message to Cush. This was a prophecy that the people of Cush would one day worship in Jerusalem. In chapter 19, you have a pronouncement against Egypt. All right. Now, Egypt at one point was a source of protection from famine. Okay. Because remember, the brothers sold Joseph. He ended up in Egypt, kept his family from famine. Then Egypt also ended up being their enemy and persecutor. All right. Because at one point in time, Egypt was the greatest power in the ancient world. Now, eventually they would be conquered under God's judgment, and he would even dry up the Nile so they wouldn't have a water source. Then we have chapter 20, and it's titled No Help from Cush or Egypt. All right? Now, you can rely on God, and you'll have nothing to fear, and the outcome will be good. Or you can rely on man, and you'll have everything to lose. That's a promise. Okay? And so chapter 21, there's a judgment on Babylon, a pronouncement against Duma, and a pronouncement against Arabia. All of them will be conquered by the Assyrians. Then chapter 22, you have a pronouncement against Jerusalem and a pronouncement against Shebna. Now, Shebna was a high official in Judah, and Elkanah was a faithful servant of God. Shebna sought glory for himself, which got denied. Elkanah sought nothing and then ended up with honor. And so for me, I said, Lord, remind me that nations need godly leaders, yet godly leaders alone can protect citizens who refuse to repent of their wickedness. And my question for you is, you do know that the smartest and brightest people you know will never be a match for the one who is the source of all wisdom. And then we get to Psalms, okay? With Psalms 22, and the first one is from suffering to praise. My God, why have you abandoned me? My God, I cry to you, but you do not answer. I will give praise in the greatest assembly. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. And then Psalms 118, which is a thanksgiving for victory. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. I called to the Lord in distress, and he answered me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humanity. And then we have Psalms 62, trusting God alone. I am at rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I will never be shaken. And then we get to Matthew 26 through 28. And the 26th chapter talking about the plot to kill Jesus, the betrayal at the Passover. They talk about it. Jesus talks about the betrayal at the Passover. We have the institution of the Lord's Supper. They had the first Lord's Supper there, also called communion. Peter's denial is predicted by Jesus. And Jesus has his prayer in the garden because remember, Adam lost our rights to everything in the garden. So Jesus returns to the garden to get it all back. Judas' portrayal of Jesus. Jesus faces the Sanhedrin council. And then Peter denies his Lord just as, Jesus predicted he would 3 times. Then you get to chapter 27 and you have Jesus handed over to Pilate. You have Judas hangs himself. Jesus faces the governor. Jesus or Barabbas, and we know how that story ended. They released Barabbas, a murderer, and kept Jesus to be crucified. He was mocked by the military. He was crucified between 2 criminals. And you have the death and burial of Jesus. And then we talked about the closely guarded tomb. And then finally in chapter 28, you have resurrection morning. The soldiers who they bribed to lie as if somebody, took Jesus from the tomb. Not that he resurrected, but they took him. And then you have the Great Commission, which talks about evangelizing and discipleship and baptizing in the name of the Lord. And then we get 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. And Paul wrote this letter, because now we're dealing in Corinthians, to deal with the worldliness that had entered the church at Corinth. Chapter 1, he gives his normal greetings and thanksgiving. And then he talks about the divisions at Corinth. There were illegitimate divisions versus a unified church. There were rivalries, based on who they like. Like, I like this minister of music. I like this preacher. I like whatever. So everything was a rivalry based on who they like. He talked about Christ, the power and wisdom of God. All right. God's wisdom has a divine perspective and point of view. It talks about boasting only in the Lord. Okay. When you are evangelizing or witnessing to somebody, your confidence should never be in you and your eloquent speech or the whatever it is you said or did. The confidence should always be in God. Then you have chapter 2, and you have Paul's proclamation in spiritual wisdom. Okay. It talks about life perspective is nurtured by when your life perspective is nurtured by the Spirit, then it's mature. Right? You have God revealed his word, all right? And you need the Spirit to illuminate that word so that you can fully understand it and apply it. It talked about worldly thinking has no access to the things of God. And then we have spiritual believers evaluate everything from a divine perspective. At least we should. And then you have the mind of Christ is the capacity to think Christ-like thoughts so that you can live as you should. All right. And then I said, Father, remind me that it is Christ and Christ alone to whom we owe our loyalty. And my question for you is, you do realize that to call on the name of the Lord is a privilege for you and me. So those were our travel notes for this week. Next week's travels includes Isaiah 23 through 35, 2 Chronicles 28th chapter, 2 Kings 17th chapter, Psalms 65 and 66, and then we'll have 1 Corinthians 3 through 7. Okay, until next week, thanks for traveling with me and happy travels.